Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm a trustee chair in Chinese business and economics here at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program, China's Entrenched Inequality Problem, where we're unveiling a new report on inequality in China and what it means for China and the rest of the world. This is the second feature of a collaboration between CSIS and Stanford's Center for Chinese Economics and Institutions, SCCEI, for Big Data China. The first feature we issued in February was on public opinion in China, featuring the work of Jennifer Pan and Yiqing Xu. Terrific research, and we were proud to inaugurate Big Data China with their work. The second feature on inequality highlights the work of Scott Rozelle and his many collaborators, both at Stanford University and around the world. We are delighted to be able to work with Stanford and his center on this project. The goal of Big Data China is simple: to take path-breaking, quantitative scholarly work on China and translate it into a language that the policy community in Washington, D.C. can understand and use. And the work on inequality, as the work we did on public opinion, is desperately needed in Washington to help improve the quality of the policy conversation and American policy. I want to thank Scott Rozelle and SCCEI for all of their work, not just on this feature, but everything they do to make this project work well. And also want to thank our star-studded panelists who have joined us today, Mary Gallagher, Mary Lovely, and Marty White, who will offer their feedback on the report and the broader topic in just a little while. It's an honor to be able to have them join the program today, and I learn from them all the time, and I know that we'll learn from them in this program. I also want to take hats off to my team at CSIS in the trustee chair, everyone who works on the program and project behind the scenes, as well as Ilaria Mazzocco, who is our official lead interpreter, the translator in chief of the quantitative data that we get from our colleagues at SCCEI and put it in a language that Washington can understand. And she's the author of the CSIS report that is on our website for you all to see. This is the second major report that Ilaria has published this week. Together with our economic studies program, earlier this week, we published a report on Chinese industrial policy spending, a monster collaboration. If I were Ilaria, I'd be exhausted. And I hope that she gets a break and gets next week to relax. No reports due next week for sure. But I just want to express our appreciation to you for your hard, successful work on multiple projects at the same time. And I think the Washington policy community and everyone watching today is the beneficiary of your efforts. So let me turn things over to Ilaria, who will run the program from here to conclusion. And I will just say that for those of you who have questions watching out online, you can submit those via our website that's listed for the program. With that, Ilaria, over to you, and everyone, thank you for joining today.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for the kind words. I'll be enjoying my vacation next week, but I'm so happy and proud to be able to introduce Scott Rozelle, and also I will be introducing this very distinguished group of panelists after his presentation. I joined Scott in thanking everyone that participated and made this possible, including starting from SCCEI to all our team members. I'm delighted to welcome Scott Rozelle, who is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and co-director at Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, SCI. His he has a very long bio, very long set of distinguished research that he's done, and I won't go through everything, but let's just say that he is a true expert on China's rural economy and society, and has been doing this research for a long time. So it's been a treat to dig into his research and his data and try to sort of interpret and tease out the policy relevance of all of that. And so I'm really looking forward to his presentation and to discussion afterwards. Scott, over to you. I think you're muted, Scott.
I was just working on the screen share. Thank you, Ilaria and Scott, and to panelists and to the whole team that made this possible. Let me move this up. Okay. There we go. I'm going to keep this short, and I think Scott introduced our initiative that SCI is really undertaking as sort of our public good investment in trying to really take high quality, quantitative based research and translate it into a language that our fellow citizens, our colleagues, the leaders and business community in Washington New York, the whole US and in fact the world, trying to really get people to understand what's happening in China. Well, I'm going to give a talk today, and this is not a China bashing talk. You're going to see some things that show that China faces some very severe challenges. I think if you listen to our big data China feature one, it was about public opinion in China. And what you saw was most people in China, are people like you and me. They want to have good lives. They want to have their children educated and grow up in basically peace and in a stable, growing economy. And that's what I want, for China too. I want it because, for the people in China. Okay. I want it for the stable and security of East Asia and for the prosperity of the whole world. I'm a development economist, and I think a growing China, a China that grows transparent and fairly and playing by the rules, obviously that's important, and there needs to be progress in the area. That's good for all those people. So that's the basis of our work. So let me go. I'm going to keep this short. I really want the panelists who are my colleagues and some of their friends for many, many years. I want to hear what they have to say about this. And so everybody knows here, China is known for its fast growth over the past 30 years, 40 years, right? And you can see, 8%, 10%, 12%, but this growth is slowing now, okay? 2016, 2014, it's down around, 5% according to national figures. And, where is it going now? I mean, I think with some of the things that are going on now, we'll probably see very low growth in 2022. It's like I said, we want it to rebound in the way that a fair and transparent economy should. While slowing growth has raised concern inside China, there's one other characteristic of the economy that's really become an issue lately, and that's inequality. Inequality, just to put it basically, is very high, maybe on the rise even from high to higher when we look at the data. And you can see those figures along the top. We know in the United States, we have high inequality. The inequality in China is higher. Our inequality is more or less stable. We need to bring it down. That's what I think personally. But I think China has an inequality that, if anything, I think has the danger of growing even higher. And it's not just income inequality. And you can see that the inequality is bunched up, and you have these, if you take, income, if you take assets and put it across the quintiles there, what you see is a very distorted economy where 60% of households, that's 800 million people, okay, only access a small 20 to 30% of the income there. And these, it's hard to say how high this is, but let's listen to what Premier Li Keqiang says. He says 600 million, half of China lives on 1,000 yuan per month or less. That's $5 a day or less. That's poor. Okay, low. China says they don't have poverty, but that's very, very low income. Research shows done by Chinese scholars that are based in Canada, the US, Europe, and China together show that 900 million individuals live on less than $10 a day, 2,000 yuan per month. That's a lot of people at a very low level. Yes, there's 350 million people in world middle class, but there's a lot more people that are at low income. Because China knows this, okay? The government itself has launched a movement called Common Prosperity. Some of the panelists are really going to address this. I'm not going to go and define this now, but the goal of that set of policy initiative is not only to let prosperity rise, let China's economy to continue to grow. If you're going to have common prosperity, you need to continue to grow. But the way it's stated is they want to allow everyone in China, all these people down in these lower quintiles, want to enjoy that future prosperity. So that's really what is at least in the minds of a initiative that's been announced. Whether how much it's realized, that's what we're going to talk about here. But just trying to shift income between these groups, I think there's even a more fundamental challenge. And that's to allow individuals to enjoy the fruits of China's, it hopes, high economy in the future. The experience of the world has shown that if that's able to do, it's not just shifting income around. We know that here. It's that the labor forces of countries that want to continue to grow from where China is today, middle income to high income, that's where it wants to be 15 years from now. That labor force needs to have a relatively high level of education. Is the people to move from that lower quintile up, they need to participate in this economy. And to be able to participate in this economy, they have to have the human capital to do so. The math, the science, the language, the computer skills to participate in a high income economy of the 21st century. The problem is China's level of education of its whole labor force. This is of people from 18 to 65, okay, is one of the lowest in the entire middle income world, certainly in the upper middle income world. Here's a graph I think that Ilaria and team put together. I think it's just fantastic. It shows it in a single, there's income along the x-axis, there's education along the y-axis. You can see that in 2015, less than 30% of the people in the labor force, okay, which means 70% of the people in the labor force have never been to one day of high school. Okay. They have almost no math or computer or science skills. and they don't have that ability to learn how to learn. Okay, and you can see, here's the G20 way up here. Here's OECD. Our colleagues, around the world. But the other dots around here, these are the other middle income countries, and they've been stuck in middle income for the past 60 years, okay? And China is bunched with them down there. So that's a real challenge. Is China going to be able to, at this level of education of their labor force, are they going to be able to continue to grow in ways that all the other countries in the world that have had education levels like them not been able to do? I think this is a real challenge. And it's not just shoving everybody into school. I have a colleague here at Stanford named Eric Hanishek, who is a economics of education economist. He developed economics of education. He has a lesson. He has a saying. He says, if you put people into school, make sure that they're going to learn. Because if you don't, it's a double waste. You're wasting their time and you're wasting fiscal resources. I think that this shows that China has even a more fundamental problem. Here's reading test scores. Okay, this is the ability to read and sort of learn, engage any type of literature. And it's a international test called PEARLS. So it's basically reading. And here's all the countries in the world that have ever taken it. There's 50 of them. Rural China, which is 60 to 70% of children in China are from rural China. When we give this test to any sort of group in rural China, they score the lowest on this test of any other country that's ever taken it. I mean, that it's almost like they don't have that ability to learn how to learn. And my group has been looking at it, and I could go on and on. Ilaria told me to keep this short, and I'm going to. But it's, there's fundamental problems of cognitive development. There's poor quality of schools, and it goes on, and there's family problems that are related to the residency system of China that don't allow families to move into cities as a whole, et cetera, that's all underlying this. So this is a challenge that has many, many dimensions. So the last thing I'm going to do is really, I'm sure that question is, well, what does this have with the economy? Do those guys matter? Do we see any impact on that economy yet? And what I want to show you is a Chinese economy that's changing very, very fast. We think of China as the manufacturing engine of the world, and this economy that's constructing freeways and high-speed rails. And what we see now is an economy that's in the midst of changing. Manufacturing labor is falling. Construction labor is falling. There's basically all of China's labor in the entire labor force is going in the two areas. China, I don't want to say China doesn't have a higher education system. 30% of the labor force has been to high school, and 20% of it has been to college. And you can see these high-skilled professional jobs, right? The bankers, the professors, the doctors have gone up over time. So that's the rise of China that our businesses want to be and to sell them. But most of the people are being dumped into the labor-intensive, I call informal gig economy, okay? And that new entrance into the labor force, people that are laid off manufacturing, they're being dumped into this labor-intensive service sector. That's you're going to see that has a characteristic of being in the informal economy. And you can see here, China's economy is now 60% characterized by informalness. I mean, people don't have a unit. They don't belong to a unit. They aren't covered by national social security, by unemployment insurance. They really aren't covered fully by labor laws. And it's growing at a very fast rate. And the number of people in the formal economy is falling. This looks like economies that happened in Mexico and South Africa and Turkey and Brazil And, when this informal economy gets big enough, it actually starts dragging down the rest of the economy, not letting it advance the high income. And you can see who's in this informal economy. So these are the same manufacturing, construction skills. It's all dumped into this labor intensive service sector. It's little repairmen standing on the side of the road. It's women hawking fruit at the, on the street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's what China's economy is increasingly being made up of. And look what's happening to wages. Oops. Oh, did I lost my screen. There it is. Sorry. There we go. Look what's happening to wages. I've taken wages and divided it into the informal wage rate and to the formal wage rate. And the light gray line is GDP. And you can see that for years, this informal wage rate was actually growing faster than GDP. But as more and more people get dumped into that sector, and as the formal sector falls, you start to see informal wage rates fall, and they're in 2020, 2021, 2022, they're actually negative. It's only through 19. Look at formal wage rates; they aren't growing. So this is salaries of professors and doctors and investors. They're staying equal, and so we really start to see I call it is this the start of polarization? So let me summarize. This is my last slide for takeaway points. China's growth has relied heavily on unskilled labor. Most of these workers have not been to high school. They have little or no skills in math, science, computers. While the national growth strategy has been effective for 3 decades, now manufacturing construction labor is falling. The low level of human capital of China's labor force may make it impossible for them to work in the formal workplace, especially as we try to go towards this high income economy in the 21st century, where jobs require math and science and computers. China's national data show that the labor market is now experiencing a fall in the growth rates of the unskilled wage. And like I said, during COVID, incomes are negative. People are poorer and wage rates are lower than they were in 2018, 2019. This is the start, perhaps, of an economy-wide polarization. Coupled with low levels of social protection, we haven't even talked about that, the fact that 900 million people are low income means that a national strategy to generate, stimulate demand and growth in the economy through the service sector is going to be hard to do when 3/4 of your economy is low income. People with low income, people with low social protection don't consume services, and that's what's being produced. With China's level of inequality of income and education, there's been no middle-income country over the past several decades that ever been able to maintain growth and move into high income. Is China part of that? Is this a new era? Is this a new country? Certainly there are differences between China and all those other middle-income countries. But I think that, big data China, I want to show to us that there's, serious underlying challenges to China's future growth. Is China going to become the second world superpower and economic power? This says there's certain challenges to it. To China, it says you really, really better take your human capital seriously. They have done some serious investment, but if common prosperity is they need to really shift gears and do something much more dramatic in the investment. I want to thank everyone for listening. I'm looking forward to comments from the panelists and questions from the audience. And thank you once again to the CSIS team for everything they've done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very interesting, as I'm sure it was going to be. So let me just move on to the panelists. I'm so excited to welcome here Professor Mary Gallagher, who is the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor of Democracy, Democratization, Human Rights at the University of Michigan. where she is also the director of the International Institute. Dr. Gallagher has consulted with governments, international organizations, and corporations on China's domestic politics, labor and workplace conditions, and urbanization policies. We also have Professor Mary E. Lovely, two Marys today, who is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and Professor Emeritus of Economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Her recent work it focuses on China's foreign direct investment policies, trade flows, and the relationship between proximity to export markets and cross-city wage variations, as well as Chinese variety of topics relating to China's economy. And then finally, we have Professor Martin K. White, who is the John Zawastra Professor of International Studies and Sociology, Emeritus at Harvard University, and Senior Non-Resident Scholar at the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, George Washington University. And he has long focused on social organization in China and social change in China and inequality. So welcome all. I think I would really love to hear all of your thoughts on, and then provide Professor Scott Rozelle with the option to respond on what the state of inequality in China is today. And so thinking of the data that Professor Scott Rozelle, or data that may not have been included, for example, the role of the hukou or labor trends, I think I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. Maybe we could start with Professor White. I believe you're muted.
Okay. What I want to do is to focus on the human capital education part and take off from Scott's very important findings and arguments, because he's basically saying it's not enough that China has great and growing university enrollments and producing lots of engineers and scientists. If they don't have better general education of the whole population, they're not going to make it out of the middle income range. And the question is, and that China currently rates very poorly, as Scott's data have demonstrated, compared to even a lot of other middle income countries in terms of the extent to which people have at least a high school education. And the question is, China, such an ancient civilization with such a high value of education, how did they get in this mess? Okay, and so I want to step back very briefly and mention a little of the post-49 history that helps explain that. So briefly back to the Mao era, okay? You had, under Mao, you had some impressive gains made in health and in basic education of the population, eliminating illiteracy and so forth. But in the countryside, the rural population, which was then more than 80% of the total population, you had imposed after the end of the 1950s a system that can fairly be characterized as socialist serfdom. People were bound to the soil. They were prevented from voluntarily deciding to leave the countryside and go into the towns and cities, not to mention overseas, to seek better opportunities, the way Chinese peasants had done for millennia. So you had this situation of some respects improvement in their lives, but they're totally stuck at the bottom of society. In the reform era, what happens? Two major changes that seem somewhat contradictory. First, socialist serfdom is eliminated by releasing peasants, rural people, from these migration restrictions. So they're able to flood out into the towns and cities and seek employment and better opportunities. And we all know, some estimates are there are more than 300 million rural migrants in China's cities today as a result of this. They are the exploitation of migrant labor is the major engine that has driven China's extremely impressive economic boom that Scott showed us slides about at the very beginning. But the second very important consequence was that education beyond the basic levels in the countryside virtually totally collapsed. Rural upper middle school education and beyond, in 1977, according to Chinese figures, nationwide, rural and urban, there were 18 million students studying in upper middle schools. 6 years later, in 1983, there were 6.3 million. So a 2/3 cut in total employment. And as you can imagine, this was basically the 6.3 million are basically almost all urban kids. So from that point onward, for decades on into the new millennium, I've never seen a specific policy statement said, well, we should cap the education that rural origin people get so that urban people can get ahead better or whatever. But nonetheless, that's the actuality of what happened. So there was a gradual rebound of rural upper middle schooling, but much more rapid increase in education for urban hukou kids. So the hukou system didn't prevent migration anymore, but it still meant that the entire rural origin population, were second-class citizens. And so when China began its massive expansion of college education after 1998, there may be something like 10 times as many college students today as there were before this expansion. It's overwhelmingly urban hukou kids who are the beneficiaries of that. So by 2005, 2006, when Scott shows some of his tables in some of his articles, the modal education for a rural origin kid in China is lower middle school. Increasingly, by then, in urban hukou kids, the modal level of education is college. So China has had this Chinese population overall is much better educated today than it was at the end of the Mao period. But almost all of that better education has gone to urban hukou kids. And as Scott has showed us, and many others, 2/3 of Chinese population still today, Chinese youth still today, have rural hukou. So, many, and so concretely, what does this mean in terms of kids from the countryside? And there's not time to go into it in great detail, all the specific institutional barriers that were set up. So until well into the first decade of the new millennium, migrants couldn't have kids in the city or bring kids to the city and enroll them in urban public schools unless they paid very high fees. So you had 60 million left behind children. I don't know what the figure is today, but you often saw this figure cited. Even though there were policy changes in the first decade of the new millennium saying that urban public schools can educate migrant children, it still has become, at least in the large cities, and I should say I don't have much information about what's going on in small towns and cities, but most of our information is about large cities, and it's still very difficult for migrant kids to get into urban public schools. They're competing for places with urban hukou kids, and they fill up the slots, and then the migrant kids fill in behind and maybe in separate classrooms because they're slower or whatever. And furthermore, for reasons that have never been explained, these migrant kids, they can proceed to lower middle school graduation in these urban schools, but then they have been generally prevented from taking the zhongkao to get into urban upper middle schools. So academic high school education is still blocked to them. And the entire emphasis that Scott mentioned, recent efforts to redress this huge neglect of education beyond lower middle school level for rural origin kids, has been to rapidly expand and invest in and subsidize vocational schools. So you can't go on to attend upper middle school in the city, but you can go into a vocational school, or you can go back to your village and but if you go back to your village to try to get into an academic high school in a rural area, you generally have to be in a boarding school. Well, how many urban kids have to be in a boarding school in order to attend high school? It's just, so this entire system that still systematically discriminate. You will see some Chinese propaganda statements that the hukou system has been eliminated, or it's been abolished, or it's on its way out of it. Don't believe a word of it. It still has a pernicious influence on that society. So
Thank
that
you. Thank you. That's yeah, that's
let me just finally say the common prosperity theme. There are lots of things that could be done if they are serious about it. They could eliminate all the hoopla restrictions on upper middle school enrollment in cities and so forth. But I see no evidence whatsoever. So far, common prosperity seems like nice, pretty slogans with no concrete reality that will actually reduce inequalities, particularly in this realm. So I think I agree with Scott. I think China has a very serious obstacle. And now there's this huge prejudice built up over 60 years against rural people as of lower quality, suzhi, or even, low, low quality personnel that you want to try to keep out of the cities. And it's just doesn't make any sense in terms of China's desire to develop. They're neglecting and hindering the progress of more than 2/3 of their young people. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, you provided a very thorough overview. No, very helpful. No, great. That's actually what I was hoping for. So, Professor Gallagher, I'm going in the order I see on my screen. Professor Gallagher, perhaps you could provide us with a little more thoughts on how the labor market is developing, what the developments are, and in relation to also the data that Professor Rozel presented, and how that reflects inequality trends in China.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Ilaria. And thanks to Scott Kennedy and to everyone else for inviting me. And I'm really happy to be here on this panel. It's a topic I think is really important, as Marty was just describing, and also I think quite concerning, the direction. So what I want to do in just a few minutes is to talk a little bit about the Xi government's policies in particular through a kind of high-level comparison of the differences between the Xi administration's policies and the one that preceded it, the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao government, which left office in 2013. That administration also talked a lot about inequality and the need for redistribution and reform. It didn't use the term common prosperity exactly, but very similar sort of rhetoric. But really big differences in terms of the policies that have been pursued. So in the Hu-Wen period, what I would say we saw, and it was flawed and it wasn't complete, was an attempt at redistribution through social democratic reform of institutions. And when I use the term social democratic, which might seem like maybe a slight exaggeration, what I mean is the expansion of the Chinese welfare state and some political liberalization of civil society. What we see in the Xi period, of course, is a antagonism to the welfare state, calling it welfarism and relating it to this notion of lying flat, of Tangping. But in the Hu period, you saw the expansion of the social welfare system, both in terms of new programs for rural residents and the expansion and coverage of the old programs to migrant workers who were covered in the formal employment system. We saw better legal protections of formal workers, and we saw restrictions on informal employment and temporary employment. We also saw the empowerment of lawyers, non-governmental organizations, and civil society around labor protection and some other types of kind of non-political increases in conditions. Perhaps through a mechanism, what I might call like class compromise, not demonizing capital, but working to expand the protections to lower level workers. In the Xi government, what we see is a purported redistribution through state-directed campaigns and regulatory shocks, with very little institutional reform of the fiscal system, of the hukou system, as Marty was just talking about, or of the social insurance system. We also see the repression of labor, the repression of NGOs, but also the repression of capital through empowering the state to intervene in markets directly. I agree with Marty, we see very little to show in terms of reducing inequality or improving redistribution. And I think also we might see the beginnings of a rhetoric and a propaganda of class conflict through greater demonization of private capital, of entrepreneurs, and of corrupt officials. And one thing that I think is important to remember is that Xi Jinping remains popular. I mean, common prosperity as a slogan is popular. Poverty alleviation, even if exaggerated is popular. So I often wonder whether or not common prosperity, even as an empty slogan, might be enough to keep high popular support for Xi Jinping. Although I think his lockdown policies right now are probably not gaining a lot of popularity. So this, I think, points to really difficult the politics of redistribution in a one-party state. We see the selective enforcement of labor laws now, weak enforcement of labor laws by policy. We see these campaign shakedowns of capital and crackdowns on tech and education and even individual entrepreneurs when they're outspoken. In terms of the labor market, what we see is the protection of workers who are already within the system, and TJRNA can include state-owned enterprises, which of course are doing well, but also we can see some protection of workers in the formal system more generally. But as Scott's data show, we see under this kind of slow growth and rising wages and other automation, other things that are happening within manufacturing, we see the growing informalization of labor. We see fewer people being brought into the formal sector. And so we see these very protective labor laws that were passed during the last administration, but with very weak enforcement, so that the system, the people being brought into the formal system is actually on the decline. And Scott showed that really well in his presentation. So we see this kind of core part of the workforce, which is formal, which is educated, which is urban, which is also very small now in comparison, still receiving these protections, but we don't see that for the informal, the uneducated, and the rural and migratory workforce. I think Scott should connect his research. This is just my final comment. I think connecting this to the work done by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson in Why Nations Fail. How does a country like China move from exclusive institutions to inclusive institutions? And this is something that Marty was getting at. We see it actually falling further behind. In that book, Why Nations Fail, they talk about Korea in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, going through a process, of course, of moving towards more inclusive institutions through a process of political liberalization, which is actually also not happening in China. They don't have a good answer for why Korea made that shift. I mean, it made that shift as part of a development model shift, as well as a part of a political process of political liberalization. But I think it's growing increasingly difficult for China to do that with the growing centralization of power around Xi Jinping, and also the removal of term limits so that he will be in office, we expect, for another 5 years. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And now I'll move on to Professor Lovely. And I guess my question is also for you. How do you see inequality evolving in China, and also maybe the broader implications for China's economic trajectory, development, and what that can mean for growth or for a lower growth China?
Yeah, thank you, Ilaria, and thanks to the CSI team for putting this together, and to Scott for such great work that we've all admired for so long. But this book and this work in particular is of such importance. It's really a pleasure to be able to join the discussion. So I'm on a panel with people who are expert on education, labor. I mean, I look at sort of more macro types of issues having to do with trade and investment and longer run growth. So I will focus there. And, I guess, Scott, one of the things that Scott points to is, will China run out of jobs for these lowly educated folks? And I think that in the short run, the answer is probably not. I guess I'm a little less pessimistic, even though the number of people employed in manufacturing is decreasing. I think China's place in the global factory is going to be very hard to replace, despite a lot of the rhetoric we hear in the West. But over the medium run, I think this poses a very real concern, not only in employment, but also in wage growth. And there I see a couple of real warning signs. Excuse me. One is, of course, just automation and productivity growth, which China itself is, investing in extremely heavily and driving forward as a government policy. So in a sense, the government is deliberately putting pressure on wages by making workers, less needed, lowering the labor share in the manufacturing sector. The second is competition from other parts of Asia. And with the signing of RCEP, or the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, China, of which China is central, it's making it easier for major corporations to create jobs in other areas with lower wages, areas that themselves are seeking to improve the conditions for foreign companies, adding infrastructure, and basically creating competition for the low-skilled workers inside China itself. So China seems to be driving for an economy that is built on high-skilled workers. As we know, it has put indigenous innovation at the heart of its development strategy. But it seems to be speaking to one section of the population and ignoring this growing problem of basically, not, as Scott has described so well, low education level and perhaps even surplus workers who are forced into the informal sector to provide a living. Now, lots of people have suggested important policy responses. Certainly all the folks here, things like, of course, we've seen this a dramatic increase in the number of schools, but they're increase the education level beyond lower middle school, for example. Support households in migrant households in urban areas, another important thing. Relax even further, or perhaps even eliminate the hukou. Why are these not being done? I mean, I think it's a good question to ask ourselves, why are these policies not being done? And of course, one question is just political economy. Xi Jinping can throw lots of nice words around, and the rural areas seem to eat it up. As Mary said, common prosperity is highly popular. You see Xi Jinping's picture in rural areas. There is some real affection there. It's not just all for show. I think that, so part of it is that the political economy doesn't require him to make more investments. It's more important for him to keep the support of the urban elites. Another is just that he doesn't have the capacity, that somehow with his focus on increasing state control, the capacity to make these kinds of changes really aren't there. So you would say, well, how, what's the evidence for that? I think that many of the things that need to be done have been known for quite a while. It's been 10 years that he's been trying, for example, to reform local central fiscal relations. Most of these policies would be local, provincial responsibilities. They do not have the revenues to take these on. Yet, we know that, reform of the fiscal system has been waiting out there for a long time. We're still waiting. Why are these things not being done? I think I don't have the answer to that, but I think we see that there's political dysfunction here that's not getting things that are essential for China's development really on the road after 10 years. Lastly, I'd just like to point to the public administration. And there's been excellent work on the incentives for bureaucrats. And we have to go back and ask again, what did Chinese local officials get rewarded for? And we see, this whole COVID exercise has really pointed out there is strong signals, to put it mildly, to look up, to not look down, to pay attention to what the center is looking. I've been looking at industrial policies, as I know something CSIS has been very involved in, and you see them gradually aligning with central government concerns. So it seems to me that there's a narrowing of options at the lower level for tailoring local policies to the local areas and local needs. So you have, more risk for local officials in innovation. We're seeing more engineers than ever being put into these positions. So I think when we look at public administration as well, we're seeing not only is there something in the dynamics that are keeping these policies from moving forward, but they're also setting up a public administration system that basically is not capable of creating the solutions, even if the money were there to flow. So I hope I've raised some hackles, perhaps, or just got some ideas going from the outside of this great panel.
Great, thank you so much. I think definitely very interesting questions. Especially the one concerning on why are they not acting on these things that have been known for so long. Scott Rozelle, would you like to give a quick response? And then I would encourage everybody who's watching, you can use on the event page, you can submit questions and we'll move on to Q&A. I certainly have plenty of questions as well, but I'd like to let our those who are watching also have some input. Scott.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. All three panelists, I've been taking notes like crazy. Marty and I've studied Marty's work for 35 years, and he basically, I was given 10 minutes, I probably took 12. He finished my argument. I mean, that this education problem is a rural education problem, and he stated it absolutely perfect and got all of the fundamental problems there. Now, how do we solve it? This sort of touches a little bit on what Mary Lovely said was, it's a fiscal problem, it's a system problem, and China's education problem is really an education problem that we understand here in the United States. We have 40,000 school districts in the United States, and all of them are basically locally funded by property taxes, right? I mean, we know that in this room. China has 40,000 school districts, almost exactly the same number we have. They're all basically locally funded by value-added taxes, okay? And if you think property taxes are correlated with income, value-added taxes from manufacturing and from are even more so. And so these local school districts, even if they're told they need to do this and this and this, they just don't have the fiscal funding. More and more, there have been transfers from above, but it's far from able to do it. So, it is this system problem. And I really, think that both the panelists, Mary Gallagher hit on, I think that's, and it was again combined with something Mary Lovely said, it's a system problem, is we have this formal economy over here that's shrinking, and all the policies get implemented in there, the labor protection, the social security, the unemployment insurance, but the informal economy is completely, ignored. Why? Mary Lovely says, why? Don't they have this system in place? And of course, it's the responsiveness of the system. They look up, they don't look down. I thought that was the perfect sort of description of that. And I think that thinking of just two other things that I wanted to enhance what the panelists said was, I think this problem of informal economy and the dumping of the labor force into the informal labor service sector with not much demand is going to continue, because it is the automation and robots and the investment into AI that the national government has been doing. We don't want our firms moving overseas, right? But to offset what you saw were higher wages in the early part of last decade, they've been dumping money into that, and of course, firms themselves have been automating. And this is, I don't see any let up on that. So that's going to sort of exacerbate this problem. And of course, foreign firms, we see them moving out. It's exactly what Mary said. I think that, so this problem is here to stay. So we're going to have to deal, with that. And I have to say it for my team. We've been working on education, rural education for 20 years now. We actually started in Korea, by the way, South Korea, and where we saw that, when South Korea is a middle income country, its level of education of the whole labor force was already high. And we said, well, what's China like? And we saw it was so low. And I think that it's not only the exclusive institutions that became inclusive in South Korea, it was also this labor problem. China wants to solve this. We need to produce those schools, Marty. We need to let rural kids into urban schools. We need to make elementary schools and junior high higher quality, which is hard when you don't have any money. So we need to rev it. But we also need to get kids 0 to 3 in parental training. When 60 million kids, their parents have dumped them to grandma, and grandma who loves those kids but is raising them like farmers when they need to go to college. We've just published a paper in British Medical Journal, Global Health, that shows that in Central and Western China, where half of kids are, over half of the kids have a development delay in cognition, language, or social emotional abilities. Okay, so this is half of China. We give them the best schools in the world, and they aren't even going to be able to learn. That needs to be addressed. And guess what? If we start investing in this today, it's going to solve the education problem in 2050. And so China has a long, long way to go. And I think that those challenges there. I'll stop right there, Ilaria.
No problem. I mean, I think these are all really interesting points, and I think everybody who's listening must be really interested. We do have one first question, and it has to do with what the implications are for the U.S. And I'll just add to that, like, what are the global implications? And also what are the implications domestically for China of this growing inequality, right? So what does it mean for the U.S.? What does it mean for China? What does it mean for globally? So does anyone want to volunteer and speak for that, or should I pick someone? Professor Lovely, maybe you would like to take a shot at the macroeconomic.
Wow, that is just such, my head is like, I think one observation, which is a little not really answering the question, but is that the US continually, I think, overstates the trajectory for the Chinese economy. And responds to, it takes the bait, in other words. And I think it's a mistake that it needs to see China as it really is, and look at what it is that we are cooperating with, competing with, confronting, to use the terminology these days. And I think Scott's book has been a real eye-opener for a lot of people. It is often cited in Washington and other places, and I think that is really important. Secondly, I do think that the world, as much as we focus on the creation of, resilient and secure supply chains, which is everywhere these days, we have to realize that we are going to be deeply integrated with China for a long time. So what happens in China is going to matter, not just in terms of, availability of goods, but what is the price of these goods? And there's one sort of happy scenario where, China's gets this incredible automation, their productivity goes high, they're able to keep, global inflation in check, as they have been for 20 years, by drilling down on the price of goods. I think there's another scenario which is much less benign for the global economy, and which we really haven't talked about. And so I think that's something that we should probably begin to think about seriously in light of, what we have learned today.
I can say something about, just something about domestically. I think, one concern I have is about political and social stability in China, particularly as China experienced these lockdowns. And I think a key question is what will happen during the lockdowns to the service sector, because obviously many of these workers in labor-intensive services are rural migrants in cities. Some of them are still working, of course. We've seen pictures of them sleeping in tents in places like Shanghai. But these are very drastic and terrible conditions that they're in. They're receiving very little support. In fact, I would say in general, China's COVID response in terms of subsidies to individual workers and to households is just incredibly disappointing compared to what other countries did in terms of targeting subsidies. The lax violation of the lax enforcement of labor laws, and the ways in which enterprises have sort of been more protected and given more subsidies and things is really disappointing, given common prosperity as a slogan, and also given this idea that China is moving towards a model that is supposed to be based on domestic consumption. So all of these policies seem to me to be going in the wrong direction. But even so, so the concern in terms of political and social instability, of course, is partly about the effects of the lockdowns. The other thing that is worrying is urban unemployment, particularly urban youth unemployment, because China will see a big increase in college graduates this summer graduating. I think it's the largest class. And where are those college, and China traditionally has, when it's worried about unemployment, has worried about college graduates more in particular than, say, rural migrants who can always go back to the countryside or be forced back to the countryside in some cases.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask, the next question was on the implications of the lockdown and COVID. So I think you already partially covered that. I mean, I was just going to add that in the feature, I mean, one of the things that the policy implications that I noted is that there needs to be better planning for a low growth China and what that means for the global economy, for the US. And because I think sometimes in Washington, there's also a thought that if China doesn't do well economically, it's always good for the US, right? But this could actually have very negative impacts for the US, both in terms of whether or not there's political stability or not in China, and also whether or not there's economic growth globally. So I think that's, and I do encourage everybody to go and read the feature, because we do have some very cool graphics that show Professor Rozelle's research, and our graphic team, the iLab, has done a fantastic job putting those together. But moving to some of the other questions. I think this goes back to Professor Lovely's statement earlier that why do we not see more action? So somebody asked, what would it take for leaders to take policy changes necessary to address the trajectory, right? Or will they? So perhaps, Professor White, do you have thoughts on this? I believe you're muted.
You need to unmute, Marty.
You need to unmute.
Earlier, Scott talked about the problems of local financing of schools and so forth, and they just don't have the money and so forth. Well, but if people are looking up at the top leadership, and if the top leadership was determined, they could change the system. I know a country in which even illegal immigrants have public schools have an obligation to educate them, although I guess the governor of Texas wants to try to change that. But in our country, when there's a massive increase in the number of students, well, what do communities do? They cope. They have they issue bonds, they build new buildings, they hire new teachers, they also presumably get a greater tax base and so forth. There can be subsidies from above. Common prosperity was supposed to include, among other things, Scott, I think, talked about value-added tax versus other property taxes in our country. Well, common prosperity is supposed to include implementing nationwide property taxes on things like people's housing, which still doesn't exist. They could say, well, let's implement property taxes and use not only value-added taxes maybe, but property taxes on the houses of people in the district to support raising more funds for our school district. So we could educate migrant kids who live in the district. And so I don't know. It's obviously there's strong resistance by bureaucrats, whether it's the local bureaucrats or higher level bureaucrats. But I think it's partly also, my sense is there's still this feeling that to be a full-fledged urban citizen, you have to qualify. You have to have enough points in the systems that are sometimes used, and most migrants, they don't really qualify. What kind of a socialist country is this? Obviously, it's not really a socialist country anymore, but it wasn't, that essentially treats the majority of the population as of lower quality and not deserving of equal treatment. I don't know. I'm sorry. Each time this brings up, I start ranting.
No, I don't think it's a rant at all. I mean, I think it's obviously very, it's very, it's where we're talking about people's livelihoods, right? And people, so it does obviously, I think, sometimes we think of numbers and this whole project about numbers, but here there's actually true implications for people, for children, right? So it's important to bring that back into the conversation, I think, sometimes, especially when we're not able to travel to China, right? And it all becomes abstract.
Yeah, there's a book called The Inconvenient Generation about Shanghai. Minhua Ling, I think the name of the author is. This is about lower middle schools in Shanghai. And you have migrant kids and local hukou kids side by side in the same classroom. But when it comes time to graduation, the local hukou kids can take the Zhongkao. So these migrant kids face three very unattractive prospects. They could stop their education and try to get a job, 打工. They could return to the rural area from which their parents came, which they may have never lived in the first place, and try to get into a rural academic high school, but they would again have to board. Or they can, with some subsidies and encouragement, they could go into vocational schools, either in the city or in the countryside. But as other parts of Scott's research have indicated, China's vocational schools, many of them are put up overnight with a lot of funding, but you can't create a meaningful system of vocational schools geared to the needs of the labor market in this kind of Chinese campaign style. So these kids who have spent most of their life in Shanghai and their music tastes, their clothing tastes, what is it like? And there are descriptions in this book of going back, the ones who chose to go back to the rural native place, and how miserable, they don't fit in anymore. And they're just doing it because that's the only way they can continue into academic upper middle school. It's just a crazy system.
Could I just say something about
Yes,
the political question? I mean, I think it's instructive for Americans to think about the ways in which Chinese politics, like politics everywhere, make these types of reforms around redistribution very, very difficult. And Marty is getting at some of these, the kind of the social discrimination, but even thinking about, so with social insurance, for example, because Chinese social insurance systems are very, very local and very, very decentralized, improving social insurance will require that they pool at much higher levels of administration, provincial or even national. And that means that rich places will have to share with poor places. And to date, this has been talked about for a long time. Those rich places have been able to block reforms. And the central government either doesn't want the burden of doing it itself, because there's a lot of moral hazard, I think, for them to take those things over. If you look at something like hukou reform, of course, it's cities, particularly the big mega cities on the coast, they don't want to take over these populations, even though those populations are already in their cities, right, for long periods of time. They don't want to take on the burden of giving these people local citizenship. And then also with property tax reform and income tax reform, I mean, I really wonder, actually, do private entrepreneurs maybe prefer these like kind of shakedowns that happen every once in a while, like give to the state for charitable donations, as opposed to doing really substantial tax reform that will tax higher income people in China much more in a kind of regularized, normal way. I think maybe they prefer what Xi Jinping is doing. You just give big donations when you're asked, but then you're really not being forced to pay big property taxes or big income taxes.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for Scott Rozelle, so I'm going to just merge them. One is basically the impact of COVID and lockdowns on rural China. So if you have a sense, I mean, there's been very little coverage of that. So if you have a sense and I know that we in the feature we include some of your data from surveys that you conducted, that you and your colleagues conducted in rural China, and then the second one had to do with whether or not Chinese officials take your research seriously, or they see it as do they take the problems seriously, or do they see this as an attack on China?
Yeah. I'll take a quick shot at both of those. So our data on the impact of COVID on rural China came from the early lockdowns. So this was the 2020 when January, February, March, when we didn't think COVID was going to hit us, and it was going to be over by the summer of 2020, right? And we followed villages through village informants that we had included in other surveys before, so there was some sort of rapport and trust there. But basically, in 700 villages around the periphery of Wuhan and Hubei, so it wasn't in Wuhan or Hubei, they basically locked down the entire country from January 25th until April of 2020. And urban people, they were in the formal economy. They kept working online, right? They Zoomed to work, and they got subsidies, they got loans, and small businesses. And so basically, there was very little impact on urban people in general. The economy certainly fell. But rural people, they're in the informal economy. They don't have unemployment insurance, and they get sent back to the farm. I love that when that they say the rural people can always go back to the farm. We did a survey of 20,000 workers in a big factory owned by a U.S. company, run by a Taiwanese, basically management firm. And we asked the 20,000 workers, what were they going to do 10 years from now? And of the 20,000 workers, 1% said, I'm going to go back to the farm. Okay, 1%. And then we said, why don't you want to go back to the farm? And anybody under 30 years old has never farmed a day in their life. They aren't farmers anymore. Plus, their farms are so small that they make, in 3 weeks in the factory, they make what they make in a year of hard work on the farm. And so, so I think that there was huge negative impact on rural people in the early lockdown. They aren't working. There's no unemployment insurance. There is a big impact on them right now. And so, so, that's that, and we don't see that. And it's not even rural people are never unemployed because they can always go back to the farm. So they aren't even in the unemployment figures. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, do I take seriously? So we identify a lot of problems, and you saw a lot of problems that we've identified, today. What my group also does is, we follow Marty's colleagues there at Harvard and MIT in Poverty Action Lab, where we actually also do in the field experiments of how to get solutions to these problems. So, we learned really quick, if you go criticize the Chinese government for something, they're going to push back. But if you go and say, here's a problem, but here's a solution, there's solutions to these problems. And that's how we always characterize our research. And so, but the question is, so I don't think they take us as a threat. Okay. So we aren't blacklisted out there, but what the problem is I don't think they take it serious enough because they don't see the problem. I want to say one more thing. Marty White's work on inequality, and this whole big data China's about inequality, I think captures exactly what the problem is. And so China's had rising inequality, as you see, for the past 30 years, and it stayed high there. He would go and interview people at the top of the distribution, the middle of the distribution, and the lower end of the distribution. And until recently, everybody at the bottom end of the distribution would say, yeah, I know there's big inequality in China, and then they would say, but I'm better off than my parents were when they were this age. I'm better off than I was 10 years ago. And I think I'm going to be better off 10 years from now than I am now. That was all through 2015, everything. That's really changing now. I mean, people look ahead and they see their wages falling. They see the nature of work falling. They see them so dropping out of the formal workforce. And they say, oh my God, I don't see this anymore. I'm worried about it. And I think Mary Gallagher talked about the prospects of rising unrest and social stability. I think that if that continues, if this polarization that we see starting continues, we're going to have a lot of instability and unhappiness in there. So,
could I just have a footnote? The last national survey that I directed was 2014, so it was very early in Xi Jinping's reign, and you're quite correct. In fact, on average, our respondents in 2014 were more optimistic about how they would be doing 5 years down the road than the first survey, national survey we did in 2004. And another thing to note is that despite all of I said about how rotten the system has treated migrants, urban migrants were more optimistic. The rural migrants to cities were more optimistic because, again, the contrast with what they had faced back in the countryside had been so stark. But unfortunately, I'm too old and I don't have enough energy to do another national survey to find out. Somebody should, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. And Marty did his 2014 survey. At the same time, one of my colleagues here at Stanford, our co-director at SCI, wrote a paper called The End of Cheap Wages. And you saw the rise of wage rates in 2010, 2011 was higher than GDP growth. Okay. And so he thought, I've just written a paper called The End of Cheap Wages. In 10 years, that's turned around. And it's part due to what, Mary Lovely called the automation revolution, the investment in robots, and then the movement of firms outside of China. And then suddenly it looks like the United States in 1980, when all of our firms started moving overseas, we started the polarization that we know has continued through today. And so we need to do that survey again, Marty. Let's get two old guys working together on that.
Well, I think I've received a message that we're at time. So this was a really interesting discussion. I could have gone on for another hour. And we had many other questions, but I think we covered a lot in this hour and 15 minutes we had. I encourage everybody to follow us and Sky on Twitter. The links are at the bottom there, so you can follow us there. And stay tuned for the next Big Data China feature. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to Professor Scott Rozelle and to Sky. This was such an interesting topic, and I hope we'll be able to keep the conversation going. And so I wish everybody a good day, a good evening to me in Italy. And I thank you so much for tuning in.